Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are so excited to be with you all today, whether you are joining us in the webinar, on Facebook, or on YouTube. So excited to share this family program with you all today called MCNY Kids Create Patterns and Rhythms in NYC Jazz. My name is Charlotte, and I'm a museum educator from the Museum of the City of New York. And I'm going to be co-teaching alongside another museum educator named Jalissa.
Thank you, Charlotte. And so, like you said, my name is Jalissa, another museum educator from the Museum of the City of New York. And I'm so excited and happy that we're able to bring this program to you all with these two wonderful, amazing artists as well.
Absolutely. We just did a first session of this program, and let me tell you, you are all in for such a treat, a real treat this morning. So again, we are coming to you from the Museum of the City of New York. You see some photos of outside of our museum here. And so our job as a museum is to collect and tell the stories of New York City and its people. And so today we're going to be focusing on a really important part of our city's story, which is jazz. We are so beyond lucky to be joined by two wonderful musicians, Sarah Elizabeth Charles and Victoria Smith. Sarah Elizabeth Charles is a vocalist, composer, and teaching artist based in New York City. And Victoria Smith is a percussionist, music lover, and native Bronxite who will begin her PhD studying Black women in jazz this fall. So to help you get to know our musicians a little bit more, I would love for both of you to introduce yourselves musically with a minute of music. So Sarah, would you love to start us off with a musical introduction?
I would love to start us off. Hello, it's such a joy to be here. Hey, everybody who's watching on the webinar and on social media. I'm going to introduce myself musically with a song that I wrote about 4 or 5 years ago. I can't remember exactly when, but the song is called One World, and I'm going to do a short excerpt from that.
We all live in this one world, breathing, loving. All we have is this one world. Lovely is but this one world, twinkling, buddy. A new life in this one
I think I used this word in our last session, but it just keeps coming to mind. That was magical. I loved that. Victoria, I can't wait to hear how you will introduce yourself musically.
I'm going to use a word I used in the last session too, Sarah. That was ethereal. God, incredible. Hello. All right, I'm going to introduce myself musically. Let me tilt the camera a little bit so you can see the cool drum set I'm working with right here.
So beautiful.
Really, truly amazing. I loved that, Victoria. I loved every second of that. So thank you both for introducing yourself musically and for being with us today. It's really, again, you are all in for a treat to hear from these such talented musicians. So to give you a sense of what we're going to do today, we're going to learn how to play New York City as jazz music with whatever instruments we have around us or with using our body as an instrument. And our musicians are going to do the same thing. So in other words, we're going to make music inspired by New York City and experiment with different sounds. And the way that we'll do that is through thinking about patterns, the way that colors, shapes, numbers, or in this case, sounds repeat in a specific order, and rhythms, which is how patterns of noise sound and feel in real time. This is also the third of 3 STEAM Education at MCNY family programs that happen this spring. STEAM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, Art, and Math. And in our STEAM Education at MCNY programs, we use our STEAM skills to think about New York's past and present. And STEAM skills are those creative thinking and collaboration and innovation skills that you get when you combine the arts and the sciences. So today we'll combine physics, math, and music by learning about the sounds behind jazz and experimenting with patterns and rhythms. So here's what we'll do today. First, we'll learn about why jazz is so important to New York City with photos from the museum, and we'll think about the connection between jazz and New York City with our guest musicians. Then we'll also start to think about some ideas and generate some ideas for inspiration of how we'll play New York City as jazz music. Then we're going to really focus on the sounds of jazz music and make our own sound pattern, which will be the basis for making jazz music inspired by New York City. Lastly, we'll experiment with our pattern using rhythm and listen to our guest musicians do the same as we play New York City as jazz music. And throughout the session, you should feel free to share with us what you're thinking and feeling on Zoom. You can do that in the chat, or you can also do that in the comments on Facebook and YouTube. So if you're joining us in the webinar, you should try to be in gallery mode if that is an option on your device. That means that you can see the screen that I'm sharing, the PowerPoint, and all of our faces side by side. If you want to share your thoughts, your questions, if you have any questions for our guest musicians, you can do so in the chat. And lastly, you can respond to our polls. So the first poll that we're going to launch is just so we can get a sense of who is in the webinar with us. So if you could tell us how many people are watching from your device and how old you are. You can choose multiple answers if you are watching with someone who is a different age than you. Just leave this up for a few moments so that people can vote. And while I'm leaving it up, I will just say again how excited I am and energized by the music we've already heard from Sarah and Victoria, and how eager I am to hear you both continue to share the sounds of your instruments and how you improvise with us. Just leave the poll up for a moment longer. All right, thank you, everybody. So now we're going to dive right in. And in order to, at the end of our program, play New York City as jazz music, we first need to know a little bit about the story of jazz in New York City. And as I share with you some of this story, we're going to look at some really interesting photographs and drawings from the museum to help us learn about what jazz looks like in action. So that I could learn more about the story of jazz in New York City, I met with someone whose job it is to know a lot about the history of music and teach other people about it. And her name is Dr. Fredera Hadley. And here's what she explained to me. So jazz is a genre or type of music. It's a way to build community between musicians. And my favorite thing that Dr. Hadley said to me is that jazz is an adventure. So when musicians create jazz, some parts of what they create are planned in advance and other parts they come up with in the moment. In this photo, you see Louis Armstrong playing a trumpet. Jazz is really about connecting with other people in the moment that you're living in. And when you do that, when you come up with music in the moment, it's called improvising. We're going to talk more about that later on. So some of the instruments that you will often hear in jazz are piano, bass, drums, voice, saxophone, trumpet, and guitar. But musicians also make jazz music with many other instruments too. So here we see a jazz musician playing drums, just like Victoria, as she just demonstrated. And drums are like the foundations of jazz. So as we look at this photo, I want to tell you about some of the foundations of how jazz was created. So jazz originally comes from the southern states of the US and then made its way all the way to New York City and many other cities across the country and the world. Jazz was created by Black musicians in the South who were inspired by different types of music making that other Black musicians had created before them. And they took these different types of existing music and added new ideas and styles and techniques like improvising to create jazz. And a big influence on jazz music was music from different countries in Africa. So I now want to share with you why New York City is really important to the story of jazz as we look at more photos of jazz musicians from the museum. So almost 100 years ago, many jazz musicians came from other parts of the country to New York City because there are more opportunities for musicians here, including the opportunity to have your music broadcast on the radio all around the country. And what that means is that our city, New York City, was the place that many talented musicians traveled to from near and far to gather, listen to each other, and make music together. So one of these people was Mary Lou Williams, who played the piano, and she came to New York City from Georgia. And another person who came from much closer is Ella Fitzgerald. She was a singer and band leader who moved to New York City from Yonkers, which is just north of the Bronx. So we just talked about why New York City is important to jazz. So now we're going to flip the question and talk about why jazz is so important to New York City and why we as the Museum of the City of New York tell the story of jazz as a way to tell the story of New York City. And we'll see even more photos of different jazz musicians and jazz in action as we think about this question. So jazz came to New York City during a really special time in our city's history called the Harlem Renaissance, which was this period in time about 100 years ago of major creativity for Black New Yorkers in a neighborhood in Manhattan called Harlem. And this neighborhood became a place where writers and artists and poets came and collaborated and shared their art with each other. And it also became a neighborhood that many jazz musicians moved to and performed in. So one of these people, for example, was Duke Ellington, who moved to Harlem from Washington, D.C. to perform as a piano player. But this special time of the Harlem Renaissance isn't the only reason why we tell the story of jazz in order to tell the story of New York City. It's also because jazz and New York City have a lot in common. So for example, New York City has always been a hub of activism, and jazz has always been a form of activism and resistance. So jazz musicians took inspiration from spirituals, which were songs that enslaved people in the United States sang, which were powerful forms of resistance. Jazz was and also is a way for Black musicians to celebrate their Black identity. New York City is also a place with many cultures, and jazz was created when people from different cultures and places came together, collaborated, and added musical ideas from their own lives and cultures. You can also hear jazz across the 5 boroughs, and we still celebrate jazz as a central part of the history of our city, simply because how many jazz musicians have come here to make music and how much jazz and New York City have in common. So for example, in Queens, there's a museum dedicated to telling the story of this trumpet player who we're seeing again, Louis Armstrong. And he was a musician from New Orleans, Louisiana, and he moved to Corona, Queens, and he was known for sitting outside of his home and playing his trumpet for all the children in his neighborhood. There's also a jazz museum in Harlem whose job it is to celebrate this form of music. Now, you could spend your whole life studying this amazing genre of music. But now that we've learned just a little bit about what jazz is and why jazz and New York City go hand in hand, I really want to hear from our New York City-based jazz musicians. So Jalissa, what do you want to know from our musicians first?
Yeah, no wonder if Victoria could answer this first, but how does jazz shape how you feel or how you think about yourself as a New Yorker?
Yeah, so a little bit about me. I am a native New Yorker, like Charlotte mentioned in the introduction. So when I think of New York, I think of home. And the thing that I love the most about New York is just how diverse it is in every sense of the word. You have ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, you have people coming from various parts of the country, coming from other countries, and it's just a cultural mixing pot and melting pot, I think, in every sense of the word. And when I think of jazz, I think that's a perfect reflection of New York City. Because as we just learned, we had people coming from different parts of the country, but also people coming from other countries as well. We have a lot of people coming from the Caribbean also, and then moving to East Harlem, or also known as Spanish Harlem. And then you had different facets of jazz. You have Afro-Latin jazz, and then you had people who were contributing to just regular, I guess you can call it, or non-Afro-Latin jazz. So it really is a mixing pot. So I think knowing all this about jazz and understanding that it's an extension of just the diversity of the city really shapes the way that I view myself as a New Yorker. I think that I'm an extension of that, or I guess a product of that heritage as a New Yorker and as someone who's a jazz musician.
That was so beautifully said. And I love how you talked about the influence and just all the cultures in New York City, is how much it just shapes everyone and music in itself too. That's amazing. Sarah, would you also want to jump in?
Yeah, totally, Jalissa. Victoria, thank you for sharing all that. I'm not a native New Yorker, and so I have sort of like native New Yorker envy. I wonder who I would be if I was born here. But I'm originally from Springfield, Massachusetts, and I moved here about 14 years ago to go to college. And I remember feeling the diversity that you spoke about, Charlotte, earlier, and that you just mentioned too, Victoria, immediately upon moving here, just feeling all of the types of diversity that you just mentioned, and also just the different personalities and types of people, just in the way that they moved through the world and the way that they expressed their creativity immediately upon moving to New York. I felt that energy and felt very much at home in that, and felt very comforted by that. I always felt kind of weird growing up, like I was different, or didn't necessarily fit in, or and moving to New York really helped me feel like I could embrace that difference and just be myself. And jazz helped me do the same thing. The freedom that exists within the expression of jazz, just the act of making the music, and for me as a vocalist, just singing within this genre, and learning how to sing and how to be a musician in jazz, really allowed me to find my own voice and embrace that and accept who I was and who I am. And it's a lifelong journey, I guess. So I'm still on that journey. But both being a jazz musician and being a New Yorker, now a Brooklynite, has absolutely shaped the way that I move through the world and just who I am as a human being.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And that's the perfect segue to the first part of our activity. So if we're working toward creating a jazz music representation of New York City, we first need to think about inspiration or an idea behind the music that we're going to create. And so as you at home think about how you might find inspiration for playing New York City as jazz music, here are some questions that you can ask yourself. So what sounds do you hear in New York City? How does New York City make you feel? And what are your favorite or least favorite things about New York City? And as you're coming up with these ideas, you can share them in the chat, in the comments, if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, any way that you can share with us what you're thinking about. And so now to demonstrate and show you how you might think through some of your ideas about New York City, we're going to turn to our guest musicians. So Victoria, I'm curious what source of inspiration you'll use as you play New York City on your instrument.
I will be using, it kind of answers two questions. I'll be using my favorite and also least favorite thing about New York City, the trains. So that's going to be my inspiration. When I think of sounds I hear in the city, I automatically think of the subway and just how there's a natural rhythm to it. There's a rhythm in terms of the time that it comes into the station, like, okay, every 5 minutes. So well, ideally every 5 minutes, don't get me started on the 4 train on weekends, but it pulls into the station, at a certain pace. There's a certain rhythm and then it stops. The sounds that you hear when the doors open and when they close, maybe the sounds you hear of other people on the train, the way the train sounds when it's pulling out of the station, when it starts going fast and when it's slowing down because it's going from one station to the next station. So that's what I think of when I think of the city. And it also just makes me feel at home. I think that's the other thing. That's the other question here is how does New York City make me feel? It makes me feel at home and it makes me feel comfortable. And I really have a sense of peace when I'm here, which is kind of interesting considering how loud it is. But I definitely feel just safe and secure in the city. And I think the trains strangely have something to do with that because of its rhythm and its familiarity.
I feel like the subway is also just the perfect embodiment of New York City in so many different ways and in the ways that you were describing. What a great source of inspiration. So Sarah, what are you thinking about? What's going to be the idea behind your musical representation of New York City?
I think the second question really kind of stands out to me. How does New York City make you feel? And I already shared a bit that I felt so comfortable upon moving here being myself, or I felt like it was like the city was giving me a permission to be myself somehow after moving here. And so when I think about sources for inspiration and when I think about, or when I ask myself, I guess the question like, Sarah, what do you feel or what stands out to you when you feel the most comfortable being yourself? And one of the things that comes up is the idea of breathing easier. When I'm able to be myself, my breath just feels more settled and I'm, it's not as tight and, there's not as much anxiety or tightness in my body. And so I'm able to really just calmly be and breathe. And so I think when it comes to the source of inspiration, breath is going to have something to do with it. Because that's definitely something that comes to mind when I think of New York City making me feel really comfortable and calm and settled in my own skin, and therefore able to kind of do anything. It's really a place where I feel a lot of possibility every time I come back home when I'm not home. And just being here makes me feel like, okay, there are so many different ways to just be and to be me.
I love that. There are so many ways to just be that. If that's not New York City in a nutshell, I really don't know what is. Thank you both so much for sharing that. So in the next portion of our program, we're really going to think about sounds. We're going to think about what sounds we're going to use to represent New York City. And at home, you can experiment with your own sounds and create a sound pattern. We'll walk you through how to do that. But first, to really get our creative wheels turning, we're going to listen to a video clip of Victoria playing in an ensemble. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment to make sure that I'm sharing sound. So that'll help us get even more inspired. I had to mute myself to clap because I know clapping always sounds weird on Zoom, but that was so amazing, Victoria. I loved hearing how your instrument, the drums, interacted with the guitar. And really, again, as I was talking about before, how you laid the foundation for the other music that other musicians were creating. So now that we've thought about our ideas for inspiration, we've gotten even more inspired by listening to how jazz sounds in an ensemble. We're really going to focus now on sounds. So how we make sound is an important part of music. Sounds are like the building block of a pattern. And this is also where our STEAM skills come in, as I was talking about earlier. So learning about the way that sounds are produced is something that scientists study. So I really want to turn to our guest artist to learn more about sound. So Jalissa, what do you want to know from our guest musicians first?
So I would like to know, how does your instrument produce sound? And what do you love the most about the sound that it produces? And how about we go to Sarah first for this question?
Yeah, such a great question. So the way that the voice, which is my instrument, my body is my instrument, my voice is my instrument, the way that the voice produces sounds is a mixture between the vibration of the vocal cords and the breath, which is something that I already mentioned in terms of feelings, but I'll mention it again in terms of technical support. So you can kind of think of your vocal cords as two folds that are vibrating at different frequencies. And depending on how fast the frequencies are, that changes the pitch. So it might be high, 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 or it might be low, 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 depending on whether it's fast, 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 or slow, 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 slow. So that's a really big part of how my instrument produces sound. But in order to support that sound, or in order to support that sound, my breath is a huge player in this kind of game of sound production. So when I'm breathing, I'm thinking as a vocalist of breathing through something called my diaphragm, which is a muscle. It's the primary muscle of breathing. And so I'm not breathing through my chest like this. You can even try that at home. It's really limiting, and your shoulders can only go up so far. They're not going to go up above your head or even above your chin. So it can be really limiting to just breathe in through your chest and your shoulders. You want to really relax this part of your body and breathe in through your diaphragm, which is more in your belly. And as you breathe in, you want your belly to go out. And as you breathe out, you want your belly to go in. So it's going to look something like this. And check out my shoulders. They're going to stay really relaxed, or at least they should if I'm doing it right. My belly is going in, out first, and then in. So you can try that at home. So the vibration of my vocal cords and the breath support are two of the technical aspects of how I produce sound. And what I love about it is that I can take my sound anywhere. I can take my instrument anywhere because it's my body, and it's very easy to move around. I've got to take me where I go. So I got to take my instrument where I go, therefore. Yeah. So that's a little bit about how my instrument produces sound and what I love about it.
That was so beautiful, Sarah. Thank you for sharing about that. Victoria, I also love to hear your thoughts on this question too.
So I know I said this in the last one that we did. I'm very jealous that Sarah is able to bring her instrument wherever she goes, because I am on the total opposite end of that spectrum. I literally cannot bring this anywhere. This drum set has left my house once. And that was a feat of nature. We didn't even bring the whole thing because it was too much. So the thing that I'll show you how my instrument works. Let me tilt the camera a little bit so you can get a better sense of what I'm working with. Forgive me, you're not going to be able to see my face right now, but the way that my drums work is I have a top head right here, which is called a batter head. And then it's kind of hard to see, so I'll point to this drum. You have the top part right here, again, batter head, and then there's another head on the bottom, which is called the resonant head. And what I do is I take my stick, or I can take my hands or some other object, and I'm gonna hit the drum like this. So I hit my drum, and what happens is with that one hit, there's a bunch of vibrations going back and forth from the top head and the bottom head. So the way I describe it is the two heads are kind of playing a really intense game of ping pong. So just with that one hit, the sound waves are going like this, super duper duper fast. And that's how I produce the sound. And depending on the size of the drum and how they're tuned, you can't really see them, but there are these silver things called lugs on the drum. And when I move them more to the left, it makes a lower sound. And when I move them more to the right, it makes a higher sound. So depending on the size of the drum and how tight or loose or what direction the lugs are in, I'm going to get a bunch of different sounds. And that's the thing that I love the most about the drums. So that's the end of the technical part. But the other thing that I love is just how diverse the drums are. So I told you about the drums that I hit. There are also cymbals and hi-hats and a bass drum that I control it with my feet. So I got this little guy right here, which is called a hi-hat. It's like two cymbals. If you've ever seen like that old school monkey toy that's going clang, clang, clang with the two cymbals, that's what this hi-hat is. And I control it with a pedal that you can't really see. So I'm literally controlling this instrument with my foot, just like this. And I'm doing the exact same thing with my bass drum. There's a pedal that kind of looks like a hammer with a white fuzzy head, and I'm controlling that with my foot. So the thing I love the most about my instrument is how diverse the sound is, but also that it's literally a full body experience. I'm using all of my limbs to play the drums.
That's so interesting too, that for you, Sarah, your instrument is your body. And for you, Victoria, your instrument is outside of your body. But for both of you, it's such a physical experience. It's an embodied experience, which I really encourage anybody who's experimenting with making sounds at home to really think about that. Think about how it feels in your body. So before we start to create our own sound pattern, I have one other quick question for both of you, Sarah and Victoria, as we start to think about sound even more. What personality does your instrument have? So Sarah, why don't you go first?
Ooh, I like this question. Yeah, I think that my personality as a person and my instrument's personality perhaps has a lot of parallels. So some of the words that come to mind are clarity or clear and light, but also very kind of direct and honest, and in certain moments intense. So those are some of the things that come to mind when I think about the personality of both my instrument and maybe also my personality.
Amazing. Victoria, what about you? What personality does your instrument have?
This answer changes depending on when I'm asked this question, where I am. So I would say for today, right now, my instrument is very bold and excited. That's because I'm feeling bold and excited because this drum set is an extension of me. So however I'm feeling, that's going to come out in how I'm playing, but also it depends on where I'm playing and who I'm playing with. If I'm doing a solo, I think it tends to be more bold and excited because it's just me playing. But if I'm playing in an ensemble, like you saw in the other video, I might be a little bit more laid back, a little bit more reserved, a little bit more quiet because I don't want to overpower the people that I'm playing with because that's not a good way to share the space. So right now it's bold and excited, but it totally changes depending on where I am and how I'm feeling.
Well, I'm eager to hear how bold and excited and clear and intense will come through as you both represent New York City as music. So we've already come up with their inspiration. Now it's time to focus on sound and create a sound pattern. So we're going to create a sound pattern with two sounds, and this will be the basis of how we represent New York City with music. And we're also using our STEAM skills here because making patterns uses our math skills. So to get started, everybody at home and our guest musicians will do the same. We'll pick two sounds. This could be two notes, two ways of making a sound, two different volumes, any two sounds you want to use. Then, when you put your sounds together and repeat them, that makes a pattern. So one example of my two sounds were tapping on the table and clapping my hands. The pattern might sound like this, just tapping and clapping repeatedly. So if you're tuning in at home and you want to experiment with, based on what you felt inspired by New York City about, you can create your two sounds and put them together in a pattern. To give you an idea of what this might sound like, I would love for us to turn to our guest musicians. So Victoria, would you like to share with us what your two sounds will be for your sound pattern?
Sure thing. Okay, let us adjust the camera again. So I am going to focus on, I'm going to focus on this drum right here, which is called a snare drum. And it's called a snare drum because it has a little lever on the side which controls this long silver strip, which you can't really see, but it's called a snare. So if I flip the lever, here's how it sounds now. When I flip the lever, this is how it sounds now. And that's the sound I want to use for this. So I'm going to use my right foot and my left foot. The right foot is controlling the bass drum, that thing that I control with my foot that has that weird fuzzy hammer head. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my left foot. It's going to control the hi-hat, the monkey clanging cymbal thing. And I'm going to use my math skills and go 1, 2, 3, 4, and use my bass drum on 1 and 3 and my hi-hat on 2 and 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to come up with a pattern on the snare drum like this. So that's my pattern. It's looping over and over again, and that's what I'm going to do for my sound pattern.
I loved that, and also reminded me of the rhythmic nature of the subway and sort of the fast pace of it, and how when you're on it, you're sort of pushed in various directions. So cool. All right, Sarah, what are you thinking for your two sounds and how they'll sound together in a pattern?
Yeah, I'm feeling very inspired by Victoria. And I'm wondering about this idea of breath and how I can use my breath as a percussive tool in my pattern. So I think my breath is going to be one of my sounds, and the other sound, I'm thinking of maybe creating a very repetitive phrase similar to what Victoria just did, but with pitch. Although Victoria has pitch in her drums as well, I have pitch in my voice in a slightly different way. And so I think I'm going to use what's called an ostinato, which is a repeated rhythmic phrase that can oftentimes have the same pitches in them too. So I'm going to improvise something. We'll see. I'm going to make something up, and we'll see using what it is. Using breath and also using an ostinato repeated pattern. So here I go. All right, those are my two sounds.
I loved that. I love how, the breath represents one thing, the pitch represents another. And I'm curious, Sarah, if you could explain to us how you're layering your breath and your voice on top of each other at the same time.
Great question, because of course there's only one of me, but then you hear two of me. So how does that actually happen? Really, really great question. Thanks for that, Charlotte. So what I have in front of me right here, when you see me looking down, what I'm looking down at is my Voice Live Touch 2 effects pedal that I'm going to hold up for you that you can see right here. And I think of these electronic devices that I have in front of me as sort of being extensions of my instrument. So I have my instrument, which is my body, and then I have this microphone, which is something I'm holding with my hand, but isn't physically a part of my body. So that's the start of the electronic extension of my instrument. And there's a cable here that's attached to the Voice Live 2 effects pedal. And then that sound is being transmitted through another little device and to the computer and to your ears and to my ears too. So I can hear myself and you can hear me. And what this device does, is that it allows me to do all sorts of effects like reverb. This is what the reverb sounds like. Hello, hello, hello. So it kind of sounds like I'm in a cave, right? And then there's also something called a delay, which I used a little bit earlier when I was performing One World. Hello, 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 hello. I love that one. It's really fun. And there's also this thing called the looper, which actually Victoria already used this word. It does the same thing that she was doing earlier, repeating the drum pattern, except it allows me to kind of have two voices. I can't use different limbs to create different sounds. Unfortunately, I can't split myself in the same way as Victoria. So I use the looper to record one voice and then play it back and record another voice on top of it. So that's what this extension, this electronic extension of my instrument allows me to do. Thanks again for that question, Charlotte.
Thank you for explaining that. That is so cool. And wild how much technology can aid us in our music making. So for this next portion, the thing that we're going to do next is really focus on experimenting and improvising. And before we do that, I want us to listen to another video clip of this time Sarah playing in an ensemble so we can get even more inspired and think about what all the different ways that the jazz can sound. I'm going to make sure I'm sharing my sound.
Goddess of freedom, casting down, colors of freedom, all around, in every stand, in the energies you
Sarah, that was so beautiful. And I'm thinking too about how you described your instrument before as being clear, but also intense. And that, I mean, I was so getting that feeling from listening to you play in an ensemble with your band Scope, which was really exciting to hear too. So now the last portion of our program will be all about experimenting with those sound patterns that we created and improvising. So as a reminder, improvising is when you come up with music that you're making in the moment as opposed to planning it in advance. So you can think about improvising like a conversation you have with a friend where you don't have a script in front of you telling you what to say. It's all based on who you're with and the moment that you're currently living in. So, Jalissa, what do you want to know from our guest musicians about improvising?
Yeah, I want to know, like, why is improvising such an important part of the way you make jazz music? And I wonder, Victoria, if you could start us off with this question.
This is like my favorite question because it allows me to go full like music nerd, but I will try and rein it in. So you cannot have jazz without improvisation. Like they just go hand in hand. And that's the thing that I love the most about jazz, for sure. It's the freedom to create music based off of your own personality and your own sound and what sounds good to you, but also, again, the energy of the room and the other people that you're performing and creating music with. And although you kind of have a guideline, and by guideline, I mean you might tell everybody what key you're playing in to make sure that, you all know how the instruments are supposed to sound when they play together, so they, mesh well together. And you might have an idea of tempo, how fast or how slow you need to sound. That's really it. The thing about jazz and improvisation is it gives you a roadmap. It gives you a guideline, like, okay, we're getting from this point to that point, but how you get from this point to that point is really up to you and the people you're creating music with. And so that's the thing I love the most about jazz is it gives me the freedom to explore sounds, explore different patterns, and to create something beautiful. And even if I play with the same group of people for a week, we're never going to play the same thing twice. Even if we are, playing the same notes, the feeling behind those notes might be different. Just something as simple as hitting a cymbal instead of a drum in the middle of a song changes the meaning and changes the energy of the tune. I think that's so special and so magical. And then quickly from a historical standpoint, I mean, when you think of jazz, you think of Black history and Black culture. And this call and response and improvisation is essential to Black music, specifically Black church music, which is, of course, music from the descendants of slaves and African rhythms and intonation. So when I think of jazz and improv, I think of the history of African Americans in my family and my culture.
That was so beautifully said and amazing, especially when you think about the historical standpoint of jazz and just how improvising has been such an important part of music, but of Black music and jazz in particular. That was amazing. But Sarah, I'm curious about your thoughts on the same question.
Yeah, for sure. I love and appreciate everything that Victoria just said. And something actually, Victoria, you mentioned in the last event was this idea of like the oral tradition and the fact that, it's not about, improvisation isn't about notes on the page and following, although that has its place and has its value too, but that this oral tradition or that this oral practice is such an important part of Black American culture too. And that improvisation is grounded completely in that. It's like your ears have to be, I say to my students that you gotta just have Dumbo ears and a Dumbo spirit, which means just like big and open and ready to embrace anything that comes. And I think that's one of the reasons I would even take like the word jazz even out of this question. Improvising is just an important part of the way I make music, period, because of my foundation in jazz and because of how important and essential of a part of jazz as a genre improvisation is. The piece that you just heard, actually, me play with my band, it's a song called Purview, and it has the same words, but it's completely improvised every time we play it. So the melody is kind of a thing, an established thing. But each time we play it, we're improvising in it. So it's like what Victoria said about it, there's this structure that exists that kind of gives us a roadmap, but then we're playing in and around and shaping and molding in different ways each night that we play it when we're on tour or at each show that we're playing it. And I love starting sets with that because it kind of gets us into like this really connected space as a band. And that's another thing about improvisation that Victoria pointed to and that I feel I agree with so much and that resonates with me, this idea that it really just allows me to not only express myself freely, but also connect with the musicians that I'm on the bandstand with. And the drummer that you saw in the video, John, might play something and I might then change what I'm going to do next, or Jonathan might change what he's doing on the bass and I might, react, or Jesse might play something that Jonathan reacts to or that John reacts to, and then I react to. So it's sort of this like soup, this beautiful like soup stew of sounds that we can all contribute to make this beautiful flavor that the audience and hopefully that we too end up experiencing. And that can never be replicated. That's the other thing about improvisation. It's like it's in a moment and then the moment's gone. So you got to say yes and to each moment, which I also really like, because it's not about being perfect. It's about acceptance and surrendering to that moment and then moving forward and going to the next. So I appreciate it, not only in my musical life, but also just in my life period as a human. It really helps me move through.
Thank you both so much for sharing all of that. I am blown away by all the things that you said. First of all, Victoria, bringing in the historical perspective, and the same historical perspective you were speaking to as well, Sarah, is so important and helps frame our understanding of jazz so much. And then Sarah, I can't get over calling jazz a beautiful soup. I think that's such a amazing description. And also, when you cook a soup, it doesn't always come out the same way every single time. It depends on what the particular ingredients that you use are. And wow, just so much to think about, and really giving all of us a lot to sit with as we listen to both of you do what you were just talking about and improvise. So I'm gonna stop screen sharing so that we can have the culminating event that we've all been waiting for, which is hearing both of you play New York City as jazz music based on all of the things that we talked about, our sources of inspiration, our sound patterns, but also how much you both shared about your thoughts and feelings about jazz. I know it will definitely inform how I listen to what you both play, and I'm sure for the audience too. So Victoria, do you want to start us off and play New York City as jazz music?
Gladly. Let me just go move. This thing looks like it's about to fall and shatter. We cannot have that. Okay, there. Sorry, I moved a piece of glass earlier and that was not a smart idea. But yes, I am very excited. Let me tilt this so you can get a better view of the drum set. And again, the inspiration is the subway. So.
What a gorgeous sound and just an absolutely stunning improvisation, Victoria. Thank you so much for playing that. I don't know what you were thinking about, Jalissa, as you were hearing that, but I just kept picturing like Rush Hour, like all of the different drums where like the different people like trying to get to work, and everybody has a million different trains that they have to catch and transfers that they have to make. But I absolutely loved that.
Yeah, I was definitely getting Rush Hour, and just, you know, in those like old-fashioned movies and they have a montage of New York City and everyone's just bustling around, seeing the trains flying by, or just like see, I don't know, cash registers at the corner store is making the ding sound and everyone is just like walking by and all this noise, like, but beautiful and crazy noise that makes sense. And that's just like everything I was getting in New York City. That was amazing, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you so, so much, Victoria. Sarah, I'm so excited now to hear your improvisation as well. So would you like to now play New York City as jazz music for us?
Yeah, totally. And yeah, it's an honor to follow that beautiful offering, Victoria. That's what I'll call it, an offering. I also imagined you moving through New York City in that soundscape that you just created. Like I was like picturing you when my eyes were closed, which was very, very cool, like waiting for the train. Anyway, I won't paint the whole picture. Here I go. I know you maybe couldn't hear my breathing as clearly earlier, so I think I changed some sound settings, and this should be a little clearer. But here I go with my breath and my ostinato, my two sounds, and then with other things that I have no idea about yet. Thanks, y'all. I love the silent claps. I appreciate them.
Also gorgeous and just wow, so beautiful. And you know, I was thinking about what you were saying before, Sarah, about freedom and like the freedom to just exist as you are. And I so got that from all of the different sounds and musical techniques you were using. That was just absolutely beautiful. Thank you both so much for sharing that with us and with everybody who's watching. Again, just what a treat. So to close out our program, I again want to thank Victoria and Sarah so much for being with us today, for all that you shared with us, both musically, historically, about your path to playing jazz and what jazz means to you. Really, what a pleasure. And thank you all so much for joining us at home and for watching and for learning more about jazz and New York City and listening to some great music. Jalissa, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just to, as we've been saying about Sarah's like beautiful talent, just ethereal. And Victoria, the way you flow across the drums, it's just amazing. You're both so talented, and I'm just so thankful that you're able to be here with us today and to share your beautiful talents with all of us. So thank you.
And Sarah and Victoria, before we close out the webinar, do either of you have any final comments?
Just thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you for sharing this space and for creating this platform. And Sarah, you are incredible. And thank you, Jalissa and Charlotte, for giving us this platform.
Yeah, I echo everything Victoria just said. Victoria, it's been an honor sharing the space creatively with you and Charlotte and Jalissa. It's been creative for all of us in different ways. And yeah, it's an honor to be here. And hello, everybody at home again. I hope that you got something out of this offering that we all put and poured a lot into. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you all. All right, with that, we hope everybody at home has a fabulous rest of your day, and we will close out the webinar. All right, bye everybody, take care.